It's nice to have you join us today. My name is Gayla Kesey. I am Education Manager here at the Augusta Museum of History, and I am so happy to have you join us for the 7th presentation in our 2022 Brown Bag History Lecture Series. And today we're excited to welcome our guest speaker, Steve Rauch. And he is coming to us from Fort Gordon, and his talk will talk about Fort Gordon and the Signal Corps and the development of Fort Gordon from Camp Gordon. And we hope that you will join us and stay a little bit afterwards. We'll have a Q&A. But before I introduce him, I would like to let you know a little bit about some of the programs that are coming up so that you can put them on your calendar. My favorite is this Sunday, and if you have kids or a family or whatever, it is Christmas in July. It's 100 and something degrees outside, so come inside to the museum where it's air conditioned, and we will be thinking Christmas thoughts. Mrs. Claus is coming down, and so she is going to be reading on the trolley and taking pictures with her. We're going to have Christmas bingo, Christmas crafts, and we have a new museum elf. Now, those of you who know the story about Elf on the Shelf know that you have to name that elf. So we're inviting our visitors to help us name. Now, the thing is, it has to have an Augusta relationship. So it can't be Sparkles or Googles or something like that. All right? The other thing that we have coming up in August, we postponed this. It's normally in February, but COVID was hitting us. So we have a night at the museum. And so we have 10 figures from history come alive. And you get to go through the museum at night. And you get to see those new people that come alive, and then the lights go back down. We are having a variety of people, from Carl Sanders to our Petersburg boat captain to a civil rights activist. We're doing Silas Norman. So we have a variety of people that you will get to meet. So those are already online. And if you are looking for ways, it's on Eventbrite, but it's on our Facebook page. It's also on Instagram, variety of places that you can get that link to register and to pay your ticket. So that is in August. And August, for those of you who are non-members, is admission for only $1 all month. It's dog days, and so we're doing that. But September, also put on your calendar, we're going behind the scenes. So if you've ever wanted to go back into the collections area and see some of those things that aren't on exhibit, then Natalie Smith, our registrar, will be leading 3 different ones on the 17th and 3 different tours on the 24th. Now the 17th is also Smithsonian Museum Day, so people can go download 2 tickets and get in free admission that way also. So it's a special time for coming up. We've got, we will not have Brown Bag in August. We always take a hiatus in August. So we'll be next, our next Brown Bag will be September, and we'll be talking about the development of the Augusta Symphony here in Augusta during this time period that we've been talking about all year, 1950 to 1980. All right, so that's a little bit about what's going on. And somebody told me the other day, there's always something going on at the museum. And I went, that's the way we want it to happen. We want y'all to come and join us anytime. All right, so with that, I would like to introduce Steve Rauch. He retired from the U.S. Army after over 20 years. He retired in 22 after over 20 years as ordnance officer and multifunctional logistician. That one's one of those $1 million words. All right. He has extensive experience as a military historian, however, for the U.S. Army, and he currently serves as the branch historian for the U.S. Army Signal Corps out at Fort Gordon. He's on staff with the U.S. Army Signal School, and he is taught in the fields of American history, U.S. military history, and public history. Welcome, Steve.
Afternoon. Have any of you heard me speak before? Any of these guys? Really? Oh, that's nice. Other than Nancy. So, is there anybody here under the age of 50 years old? Good. I don't like to talk to anybody under the age of 50. I have nothing to say to them. They have nothing to say to me. So, I'm sorry. You're going to have to leave. And I can't imagine there's anything in this presentation that I'm going to tell you today that you don't already know. But it's not about Fort Gordon per se. It's going to be about this period of time. Nancy always comes up with these themes for the brown bag, and so the 50s to the 70s or 80s, something like that, kind of puts that context in. So it's kind of interesting to try to see what I can come up with for that. I am not the Fort Gordon historian. Fort Gordon's where I work. It's not what I do. I do Signal Corps history. That's pretty much my full-time job. There are 60,000 Signal soldiers in the U.S. Army around the world, and that's who I serve. So that's whether they're here or anywhere else. It's not just this place. So that's kind of the story there. What's that? Oh, okay. Go to the next slide for me, please. Get started here.
Click it. You can click it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, never mind. Yeah.
I gave you control.
There we go. So I put together this slide, and after I did, I'm not quite sure what I'm trying to intend to say here. So, this is the 50s to the 70s, right? And you've got, what do you see here? Well, you got the atomic bomb, right? You have the threat of communism, and then you have the army watching TV. So, and I thought about this too, we criticize people today for staring at their cell phones and all the other screens. Well, that's been going on for a long time, right? You all were part of that TV generation. So just keep that in mind, though obviously we couldn't haul it around with us and take it everywhere we wanted to go. But nevertheless, this is the era when, of course, these type of technologies, the television set is seen as this breakthrough tool to teach people via TV, and how that's going to be so much better somehow, some way, than any other method. So that's kind of what you see going on here. Next slide, please. So getting back to that other point, I'm so used to doing that. All right. The era of atomic warfare. You get to go out to Nevada, gather around with your buddies, watch the atom bomb go off. You'll be fine. Don't worry about it. Not sure how good the Geiger counters were back then, but I'm sure they're much better today. If you had one from 2022 back there in 1947, I'm sure you'd be screaming right now with all the radiation that it was picking up. But back then, for some reason, after a day or two, they were okay with that. But the idea here is somewhat unbelievable. But for the 40s and the 50s, the U.S. military just saw the atom bomb as just a big bomb. That was it. And you just figured out how to incorporate that into your strategy. The idea is, as it said here from this article, when an atomic weapon hits your battalion, you just kind of got to shake it off and get back to work. What do you think of that? That's what he says. Don't worry. It's no time for despair. Just get back out there and, fight, I guess, through it. So this is the era that we're talking about. So the perspective, I guess, some of you were there back then. This was the perspective of this world of the 1950s. But I came up with this kind of a timeline of events, which are in all the little squares you see up there. And the idea was that we can kind of trace along this period, the era of atomic warfare, by looking at these key events. And this is the context for what I'll talk about, what's going on here locally. So if you start off at the far left, You know, in 1947, the National Security Act was passed. 75 years ago this year, actually this month, the DOD was formed, Department of Defense. The U.S. Air Force was born this month in 1947. So it's a big anniversary year for 1947 here in 2022. And so the Truman administration enacted a lot of legislation to, again, deal with post-war events, not really knowing what's going to happen in the future. So you have the National Security Act, as I said, that established the DOD, the Air Force, the CIA, and a whole bunch of other bureaucracies out there. Now, there still was a military draft that existed, but it was going to be more, it was called Universal Military Training. And that's going to kind of carry on throughout, meaning there will be a draft that's enacted, but it's not going to be as persistent as some people would normally think. Now, we're going to, as we enter into the 1950s, of course, the Korean War is going to kick off, and that will see the U.S. involved in that operation. Of course, the atomic battlefield is now hanging over everybody's head. And what this means, though, is for the Army, generally, if you look at that top blue box, I think it's in yellow, the effect on the Army says there's a reduction in forces, uncertain roles and missions, no equipment modernization, the nukes will be the domain of the Air Force, and there's no conventional war option, meaning the Army really doesn't have a job anymore. The Air Force is going to handle everything with a nuclear bomb. And the Air Force gains dominance at this time with the Strategic Air Command, and you know, you all saw Dr. Strangelove, so it's all kind of that whole thing going on there. Though you do have National Security Council Act 68, which is what we call the containment strategy, which causes this peacetime military buildup that we hadn't really seen before, which is also going to be persistent throughout the containment strategy. So I said the Air Force kind of takes up this primary role. The manpower piece. Everybody 18 to 26 is going to serve some combination of active or reserve component duty. No one is exempt. Even Elvis is going to get drafted, right? Mm-hmm. So that's where you're at there. The Army, of course, is trying to deal with this nuclear battlefield. They figure, well, we'll just disperse our forces. We'll have smaller units. They call it the pentamic army, because as long as you got the word amic in there, you are up to date, right? Just like today. You got cyber in it, you are good to go. Doesn't matter if you're cyber plumbing, cyber pest control, you are it, right? So amic was it, the pentamic division, which is what the Army comes up with. And as we make our way through the tail end of the 50s into the early 60s, you start seeing some big changes taking place, primarily in the Kennedy administration. There was a big reorganization in 1962 that is just massive, and it changes some of the command structure for the U.S. Army, and it moves a lot of things around. So that's kind of how that's going to affect us here. So I like graphs and data, so when I got the numbers for this, for the active Army, you can see in 1948 the low strength of 554,000 was, you know, the post-World War II Army. The Korean War, of course, brings that up, as you can see, up to about 1,500,000. And then when Eisenhower is elected, part of that whole process is to get the U.S., you know, get the Korean War over with. And it's during his administration that this Air Force prominence kind of continues, and the Army shrinks all the way through 1962 when JFK is elected. Next slide. Nope, I'm going to do that. So what's going on here? Well, how does all that stuff I just told you about affect the military here in our area? So because of this Universal Military Training Program, that's going to bring two schools here to Augusta. The Military Police School, are y'all, anybody familiar with that? Any former MPs? Because there's still a lot of them around here. And the Signal Corps Training Center are the two schools that will find homes here because of this new need for manpower. I have a quote here, not sure where it came from, but it said, the Secretary of Augusta's Merchant Association proclaimed it was the first piece of big news in many months, and that this decision would make cash registers ring in Augusta, right? Just like cyber's supposed to bring the ringing bells in Augusta. See how that doesn't change much? Now, a large-scale renovation of Camp Gordon took place, along with efforts to construct homes for personnel, right? Now, even though Camp Gordon at the time, had a large Signal Corps presence, the home of the Signal Corps was still at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. I don't know if you were aware of that. Fort Monmouth was the place. It was right next to, right in the heart of all the technical stuff up there. Y'all from New Jersey? Good deal. And so, but what this was at Fort Gordon was a satellite school. It was called the Signal Corps Training Center, and then there was a subordinate Southeastern Signal School. They got a whole bunch of this stuff is confusing, but nevertheless, it's a satellite school. And by mid-1949, the Signal Training Regiment is flourishing. The majority of soldiers at Camp Gordon were Signal soldiers. And later on in 1949, another training activity called the Engineer Aviation Unit Tech Training Center shows up. I'm not sure what they did, but they add to the population. So, of course, as we saw with the Korean War, there wasn't a whole lot of new equipment available to the Army. The Army had to make do with what it had from World War II, but the terrain and environment of Korea is somewhat challenging with the mountains. Every place you turn around in there, there's a hill. And so they had some challenges trying to overcome with that. Also, given the nature of the battlefield, signalmen often had to fight as infantry in order to preserve their communications. So there's a lot of stories of signal soldiers being involved in various combats with the enemy during this conflict. Signal soldiers were trained to be expert radio operators, carrier repeater men, cable splicers, power men, teletypists, radio repairmen, all those type of things. And a lot of that training took place here at the Signal School at Fort Gordon. The pole orchard up there, where they try to keep the basketball in the air while they're up there. Don't let it hit the ground. Then you gotta do push-ups or something like that. All right, so big event, 1956 is when Camp Gordon changes to Fort Gordon. And the Army has a terminology, camps and forts and stations. They all mean different things. The local economy, of course, was boosted. There was another school, showed up here at the Civil Affairs School, arrived in 1955. Additional signal units transferred from Fort Monmouth to Fort Gordon. And, of course, we just saw booming times. I talked about Elvis, right? Elvis went to Germany. He was in the Army. Actually, my uncle was in the same battalion as him. He saw him a couple times. Fort Gordon had Jane Mansfield. Her husband was a military policeman, Lieutenant Mansfield, that's what his name was. And so she made the newspapers quite a bit, even before she was famous. She did the local, the dinner theater type thing over there. She did a lot of those plays. So anyway, that's where we're at in this period. Camp Gordon is now Fort Gordon. Everybody is staying. All right, well, that turned out better. So now we're going to get into basically the Vietnam War period. Now, I did not have this chart before. I had done a thing for peacetime army, so I kind of left out the wars. But I've actually been studying this period of time recently because it is the 50th anniversary of a lot of this stuff. And in 1964, as you know, the Gulf of Tonkin incident triggers basically the U.S. going into war, full-out war in Vietnam beyond an advisory capacity. And there's a lot of stuff going on at that time. In 1965, the draft quota was doubled. We had the Dominican Republic intervention was taking place. There's still fighting going on in Korea. There's a whole other sub-war taking place on the border in Korea between 1965 and 1969. It's well documented, well known by people who were there. And then, of course, in 1965 is when the U.S. sends its combat units to Vietnam. And in the meantime, throughout the world, there's all kinds of things going on. You have the Six-Day War in the Middle East, later on the Indo-Pakistan War. So you've got all these things taking place. Within the Army, you see a lot of other things taking place, as we see the changes to society in the 60s and 70s. Y'all were there, right? How many of you were hippies? Some of you were. I know you were. Some of you were hippies. So anyway, okay, we won't out you on being a hippie, but I'm sure there's a few of you here. But nevertheless, you had these changes going on. You actually had the military doing a lot of domestic disturbance work, right? Quelling riots. I'm from Detroit, Michigan, so I watched the 82nd Airborne roll down the highway in 1967 to quell the riots. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I was 7. That was fascinating. It was a lot of fun. So anyway, you have that taking place. The war takes a big turn in 1968 with the Tet Offensive, and this is still an argued point in history in terms of what that meant. The Tet Offensive is this massive guerrilla attack in January, end of January 1968. The Viet Cong come out and fight, and after about 2 weeks, they're all destroyed. 80,000 Viet Cong are dead. However, it's seen as U.S. defeat. And so you've got this disconnect between what's actually happening on the battlefield versus what people think is happening that's going to cause some decisions to be made. And the message at the time is that the U.S. needs to get out of the war. And that leads to the end of Lyndon Johnson as president because he's not going to run again. And that's going to lead to Richard Nixon's election in 1969. And Nixon is elected on the platform of getting the U.S. out of the war. He's got a very interesting way of getting out of it. It actually works out pretty well. As a matter of fact, we actually won the war for about a month, but we didn't know it. And this all comes about, and I'm serious about that. Nixon and Kissinger are going to change U.S. foreign policy, right? Nixon's going to go to China in 1972. He's going to go to the USSR for the strategic arms limitation talks in 1972. Right? They got bigger things on their mind. Vietnam, yeah, they're downsizing. Notice the numbers are getting smaller. And in 1972, the draft ends. However, in the middle of all of this, the North Vietnamese kind of messed up. They decided, really instead of waiting for us to get entirely out of there, they decided to attack with conventional forces. And the funny thing is, in 1972, they attacked with tanks and artillery and all the stuff that we wanted to fight back in the 60s, but they didn't do that. And all that we had left over there was advisors with radios and the U.S. Air Force. And the advisors with radios called in the U.S. Air Force, and we decimated the North Vietnamese. Another 80,000, 100,000 troops are dead. They launched all of their surface-to-air missiles. They had none left. They ran out of ammo. We had so many planes. And like I said, in December of 1972, I read I think a British, they usually have some insightful things. Some British ambassador said, you guys won the war in December of 1972. Why didn't you, finish it? Because they had nothing left. That's why they went to the peace table. That's why North Vietnam was so anxious to get to the peace table in 1973. And they ended up getting peace on their terms. But again, the word was get us out of Vietnam, and so Nixon did, but he did it with things like mining Haiphong Harbor, bombing the hell out of North Vietnam. I mean, he just took it to them, and it broke them. But again, we just didn't realize we had won. So by the time we get to 73, as you can see here, the last units are departing Vietnam, the POWs come home. Now the Army is going to switch over to what's called the Volar Army. That was the original name. It's for the Volunteer Army, is what they called that experiment. Here's our chart again. LBJ, big fight, send the troops over there, fight like we did in World War II. The problem is the enemy wasn't fighting like World War II. When Nixon comes in, we're downsizing, and the enemy is now fighting like World War II, but we're not. So it really was kind of strange how that worked out. But nevertheless, you can see the strength dissipate to finally in 1974, about 780,000 soldiers in the U.S. Army. Okay, so what's going on here at Fort Gordon? Again, the Signal Corps is really pumping out the soldiers. And we have the new advancements in communications electronics. The transistor had replaced the vacuum tubes. You all remember the transistor, right? And of course that makes things smaller, lighter, more compact, more easy to carry around. And so all of this is taking place at that time. And of course the war increased the need for soldiers of all kinds, officers. There was in September 1965, they opened an officer candidate school here at the Southeastern Signal School. And primarily the signal soldiers that were trained here went to Vietnam. This is where they trained those guys that happened to be needed for those particular skills. They did things like setting up a mock Vietnamese village, so that you kind of had an idea of what to expect when you were there, and there's a newspaper article about that there as well. And then in 1957, a little bit earlier, this became a basic training place. And so there's a lot of people even today that remember Fort Gordon not for signal training or anything like that, but they went to basic training here, like Fort Jackson or Fort Benning. And it was a rather big thing. It was owned by Third Army. And so what else? Oh, the height of the war, 60,000 soldiers were trained at Fort Gordon. One little side note, I don't know where this came from in my notes, but in January 1961, President Eisenhower received his last formal military review of troops at Fort Gordon. Okay, so one thing I need to talk about is a soldier here, Lieutenant John Darling. And even though he never trained at Fort Gordon, he was never here. He was a signal officer. And John Darling was involved, his unit, he was with the 101st Airborne, again, in kind of the drawdown period of the war. One of the last major big fights occurs in 1970, and the Army is establishing a fire support base at a place called Ripcord. And the unit comes in their helicopters and does an assault into the area. And Darling was the battalion communications officer, so he and the executive officer went in ahead of the headquarters to set everything up. And the battalion XO was wounded because the North Vietnamese had this place really centered on their sights. And so Darling is kind of left in charge, at least of the battalion level action. And so he takes charge and moves the radios and surviving operators into a shell hole. He then carries a wounded soldier to a medical evacuation helicopter while under intense enemy fire. He then directed the gunship to fire upon enemy positions. And Darling was awarded the Silver Star on September 20th, 1970 for gallantry in action. The citation of his Silver Star said this: his actions under fire enabled the prompt evacuation of casualties and forced the withdrawal of the hostile forces. Lieutenant Darling's personal bravery and devotion to duty were in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the U.S. Army. Now, he never saw that Silver Star himself, because on May 18th, 1970, he got on a helicopter to go back to a rear base and take some radios back to be fixed. And during the flight, the helicopter was shot down by the enemy, and the pilot was forced to make a crash landing, and it hit kind of a steep embankment and rolled down and was buried under all this vegetation. I mean, it's just thick. And it took him like a week or so to find the aircraft. And on June 2nd, the Army declared 23-year-old John Darling to have been killed in action. And on July 8th, 1994, the Soldier Support Center and Garrison Headquarters over at Fort Gordon was named Darling Hall. So if any of you have any business over there, getting ID cards or dealing with any of that, Darling Hall is the place named after him. How many of you knew that? Yeah. Okay. Did you see the display in the lobby of all his awards and things? It's kind of hidden behind the corner. If you go back there where that big seating area is out there, where you kind of, wait, there on the back wall, all of his awards, the Silver Star and everything is there. So yeah, it's kind of hidden away. I mean, but it's not that hidden. But if you just kind of walk a little further in instead of heading down the ID card on the left, go ahead and check that out. So John Darling, I think it's very appropriate that it was named for him, given this event. Now, one of the other things that occurs is the training of the South Vietnamese. And the whole idea of Vietnamization was, we're going to give the South Vietnamese all of our stuff, all of our equipment, we're going to train them how to use it, and then we're going to leave, right? Yeah. Sounds like a plan.
That's the plan.
Sounds like a plan, right? But here's the thing. We had kind of done that by 1972. The only thing that saved South Vietnam in 1972 was our air power. It was our guys with radios calling in the B-52s. I mean, there were B-52s that flew 72 hours of B-52 raids nonstop. That's how much air power we had. They didn't have that after we left. They didn't have U.S. guys on radios calling in B-52s. They didn't have that. They had their own. And so, but the idea was, train them up, let them fight their own war, and kind of cross your fingers and see what happens after that. Didn't matter, because 1973 we were gone. Nevertheless, a lot of these soldiers would come to training for signal at Fort Gordon at the time. So there was a component of this program taking place at Fort Gordon. That's the whole point of that slide. Okay, moving further down the road here, getting into the 70s. This is now big changes taking place in the U.S. Army. We have the transition from the draft to the volunteer army. Now, that sounds easy, but here's the problem. When you go to a volunteer army, what do you need?
Volunteers.
And money. Money, 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 money. When you're drafted, you ain't got a choice. You get to eat in the mess hall, we'll pay you something per month. It doesn't matter. You didn't volunteer, so we'll just pay you what we think you need. But if you want people to volunteer for a job, you got to be able to pay them a wage that competes with everybody else. And then you have to start giving them all the other benefits of employment. It takes a lot of money. Initially, they didn't have that much, and they realized very quickly by 1978 and 79 that they really had to increase the pay. Otherwise, there wasn't going to be anybody around. But nevertheless, another key event that takes place is the 1973 Yom Kippur War. You all remember that one?
Yes.
Israel ran out of tanks because they got all blown apart by these little missiles. So the U.S. had to send their tanks from Germany. So we just basically gave them our stuff. And at the same time, that caused the oil embargo of 1973. People today, I tell these young kids, you don't know what it was like in the 70s and 80s. The mortgage rate in 1979 was 18%.
Yes.
My first house I bought in 1988, I had 10%. I thought I was doing great. I'm like, well, at least it's not 18%. It's 10%. They look at you like you've got 3 heads if you say that today, right? Unemployment. I'm from Michigan. 15% unemployment in that state. Because the auto industry, because of the Japanese imports. I mean, life was tough back in the late 70s, early 80s, wasn't it? So keeping things in perspective, I'm like, yeah, okay, well, stop complaining about things. You're not paying 18% interest on a mortgage yet. And so the oil embargo comes around. Locking gas caps for your cars, right? Remember those?
Yep.
Got to have the locking gas cap because people are going to steal your gas. And it might be at that today. I think we need to look into that again, right? Thinking about it. That is also going to lead to changes in the military structure as well. The Army will reorganize once again to kind of where we're at today. They come up with 3 major commands. That's going to lead to some changes at Fort Gordon. I'll talk about in a minute. But the famous, the U.S. Army wants to join you, be all you can be, the greatest marketing campaign in history, still studied by marketeers today, very effective. We'll never forget that. But there was also concern about a hollow army, meaning that, again, if we're relying on volunteers, how do we, what quality are we accepting volunteers at as well? As a side note, the Women's Army Corps, which was formed in World War II, was disbanded as a separate agency, and women were just integrated into the Army before they were all part of the WACs, and then they did other jobs, kind of like a temp agency was how that was run. What else here is on this slide? Okay, so as we get through the 70s, we get involved. The USSR invades Afghanistan. How'd that go for them? Not too good. We have the Iran hostage crisis, all that sort of thing taking place. So the 70s end on a rather depressing note, if I recall, having been there. And so that's kind of where we're at. So what's happening here in our area? Well, in the late 60s, 70s, there was, again, expansions. There's always expansions. There's 60,000 acres over there. You can build forever and not run out of space. They decided to build up-to-date, state-of-the-art classroom facilities with TVs and all that stuff in there. And kind of in that area when you come on, let me orient you here. This is Chamberlain Avenue. This is kind of nothing right now. You know what, anybody know what this was? Hospital. Hospital and all those buildings. Can you imagine that now, going over there trying to figure out what building you got to go in for that hospital? Go to building A15. Where is that? It's probably over here somewhere. I'm sure that was fun. Thank God we don't have to do that today. But yeah, now it's one stop, get into Eisenhower and figure out what floor you got to go to. So the physical expansion takes place, high-tech stuff. You know, we got to get these signal soldiers trained. We need the latest classroom facilities, even though those facilities had chalkboards in them when I showed up in 2002. So I don't know how that fit in. The $6 million project of 6 two-story signal academic buildings were dedicated to prominent men in Signal Corps history, and they were completed in 1966. So those buildings are still there right now. Some of them are going to go away. One is gone already. Ridley Hall's gone. I think that's staying. I don't know. I can't keep up. We'll find out when it's not there one day. And however, a more ambitious project was in the works. They're going to build us a tower. And in 1967, the groundbreaking was done on the 10-story Southeastern Signal School administration building known as Signal Towers. And along with Signal Towers was an adjacent Alexander Hall, which was your big auditorium, right, for teaching and lectures and all that stuff. It was going to be a college campus-like atmosphere. They keep saying that today. It's going to be a college campus. Well, it's always been that way. Signal Towers was named in commemoration for all the signal soldiers going back to the Civil War. And it featured this auditorium, had a cafeteria, bookstore, bank, barbershop, gym, and library, all in one area. There's an adjacent building called Nelson Hall, which was built that actually had one of the most advanced closed-circuit TV stations, and they did our audio-visual place there. I mean, they had studios, recording studios. That was happening even when I got here in 2002. The new and old buildings were now capable of housing 520 classrooms, some handling 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, and it was considered a showpiece for Army training. Every now and then, we will still get shift work out there. Particularly as they're getting ready to go on Christmas leave, they got to get all that training in, and they, so they kind of have to compress it a little bit. So they say, okay, you're going to school from 12 to 6 or whatever. And by the time Signal Towers was dedicated in 1970, the military population at Fort Gordon was over 33,000. There were about 3,900 Department of the Army civilians, accounting for $18 million in annual pay. Now, this growth didn't extend just to Signal Corps. Obviously, Dwight D. Eisenhower Medical Center they started that in April 1971. They broke ground, and in 1975 it was completed. One of the best military hospitals in the country. How many of you have been there before? Mm-hmm. It's a good place. I'm happy with it. Except they got this new system. You can't get any prescriptions for a couple of weeks, I guess. Just got the text. Prescriptions are down, so good luck with that. So from 1963 to 1973, $53 million in construction projects were completed at Fort Gordon, which I guess is a lot of money for those times. Yeah. Now, the big thing that happens here in 1973 is the Army reorganized. They developed something called the Training and Doctrine Command, which was headquartered at Fort Monroe, Virginia. And in this process, the Army does this every 20, 30 years or so, and they shift people around. And so they did the same thing. So what happened was the Army placed all of its schools, all of its training centers, for armor, infantry, signal, artillery, under TRADOC, which meant that Fort Gordon would become a TRADOC military installation. The following year, the Army decided to consolidate all of its signal training at Fort Gordon So on July 1st, 1974, the U.S. Army Signal School at Fort Monmouth closed, and it was all consolidated here at Fort Gordon. So this became the home of the training part of the Signal Corps. The science part of the Signal Corps was still up at Fort Monmouth doing equipment development, but you know, they're another command, so we don't really care about them. Someone at Fort Monmouth must have said it's going to be a cold day in hell when they moved that school down to Fort Gordon, because look what happened on January 8th, 1979. Anybody seen that much snow lately? We even stopped eating that much. But I think the New Jersey folks wish that on the people down here. What y'all think? Every now and then, wake them up. Some snow. So the Signal School at Fort Monmouth moved down here, and Fort Monmouth will eventually close in 2001. They shut that place down in that BRAC that occurred back in the mid-aughts. And they moved that stuff all to Aberdeen Proving Ground. So on October 1st, 1974, the organization's name officially changed to the U.S. Army Signal Center and Fort Gordon, and was now considered the home of the U.S. Army Signal Corps. Now, as part of this move as well, the MPs got shipped off to Fort McClellan, Alabama. That's where they went. And then they moved out to Fort Leonard Wood. So they got to move twice more. And so they were out of here at that time. And so since that time, of course, the Signal School has still here, still doing that training, getting some new buildings at some point here in the future. Okay, so that kind of gets us through the 70s, which is where I think we wanted to end up. So the next question is, you know, what's going to happen next? I don't know what's going to happen in the 80s. I can't predict the future. Maybe it'll be a better time. I don't know what y'all think. Anyway, that's all I got for you. Thanks.